Welcome to the Deep Dive, and thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
You've given us a fascinating set of sources this time, excerpts from John Brooks's Business Adventures.
That's right, a classic.
Think of this as your shortcut to becoming exceptionally well-informed about some truly pivotal moments in the history of commerce. We're going to pull out the key insights and surprising details, all tailored for you.
Absolutely. This collection is, well, it's like a time capsule, offering you a look into the dramatic and often unpredictable forces that have shaped the business world.
Right.
We're on a mission here to explore these historical events and understand what lasting relevance they might hold for you today.
Exactly. For your deep dive today, we're covering a huge amount of ground, from the intense drama of a major stock market drop and the legendary tale of a product that just didn't click, to the complex world of income tax, the beginnings of insider trading rules.
Yeah, that's a big one.
A revolutionary technology, a shocking story of secret deals, a fascinating fight for control of a company, one individual's surprising journey into business.
Lilienthal. Great.
The evolution of those yearly gatherings we call stockholder meetings, a high-stakes legal battle over secrets, and the delicate job of keeping a major currency stable.
Whew, that's quite a list.
It is. So where should we begin to unpack all of this for you?
Let's take you right to the heart of Wall Street. You've highlighted the afternoon of May 28th, 1962. What made that particular day so significant for you?
Well, it was a Monday, and it's remembered as a day when the stock market took a real nosedive.
A big one.
A big one. Even the ticker tape, which, was already becoming outdated, couldn't keep up. It finally finished its report hours late.
Right, which just adds to the panic, I imagine.
Exactly. And when it finally did, the news wasn't good. Major companies like American Telephone, Philip Morris, Campbell Soup, IBM, they all saw their stock prices fall quite a bit.
IBM took a huge hit, didn't it?
It did. IBM dropped by a substantial 37.5 points. Just like that.
Wow. What's fascinating for you to consider here is what happens when you see such a sharp and sudden drop. You mentioned margin calls. Could you explain to our listener what those are and why they were such a critical factor then?
Certainly. So when investors like yourself buy stocks on margin, they're essentially borrowing money from their broker to make the purchase.
Okay.
Now, if the value of those stocks drops significantly, the broker will issue what's called a margin call. They're asking you, the investor, to put up more money or securities as collateral to cover that loan.
Right, to cover their own risk.
Exactly. If the investor can't do that, the broker has the right to just sell the stock to recoup their losses.
Which, of course, pushes prices down even further.
Precisely. As you can imagine, if that happens on a large scale, it can drive prices down even further, leading to more margin calls. It becomes a really dangerous downward spiral.
Like in 1929.
That was a big contributor to the crash of '29, when there weren't many rules in place to limit how much people could borrow. By '62, there were some safeguards.
Well, if a stock you bought on margin fell to about half its original value, you could still get that dreaded call.
And for you to understand the scale of this in 1962, it was quite considerable, wasn't it?
It was indeed. Estimates suggest that around 91,700 margin calls went out between May 25th and May 31st.
91,700.
Wow. And the majority of those landed on the night of May 28th. Just picture this. You're asleep in the early hours of the morning, maybe 2 or 3 a.m., and a telegram arrives telling you that you need to come up with more cash fast or your investments will be sold off.
Oof. Not a good wake-up call.
Not at all. It really emphasizes the almost unsettling intensity of that period, as the source describes it.
Yeah.
It gives you a sense of just how precarious things can become in the market.
A rather chilling scenario for you to imagine. Let's turn our attention now to a story with a very different kind of drama. The saga of the Edsel.
Ah, the Edsel. What was it about its initial unveiling that made it so noteworthy for you?
Well, the initial reaction inside Ford to the very first full-size clay model of the E-car, that's what they called it before Edsel, was absolutely over the top.
Really?
Yeah, eyewitness accounts describe a full minute of complete silence, then spontaneous applause. And apparently this hadn't happened at an internal Ford showing, since Henry Ford himself introduced his first horseless carriage way back in 1896.
Wow. That's quite a reaction. Sets the bar high.
It really sets the scene for the incredibly high hopes they had for this vehicle.
It certainly does. And the marketing strategy behind the Edsel seems to have been based on some quite interesting ideas about consumer psychology, wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. The thinking went something like this. If there was a mismatch between the image a particular car projected and how the owner saw themselves, Well, that could create a desire to switch to a different make.
Okay, makes sense.
The specific theory they were working with was that if a man felt his current car was perceived as something a woman might typically buy, he'd be inclined to look for a car that he felt better aligned with his own self-image.
Huh. That's pretty specific.
And subtle.
Was a pretty subtle approach, yeah, aiming to tap into those underlying perceptions.
An approach that an advertising executive named Fairfax Cohn seemed extremely confident about, if you recall.
That's right. He even made a distinction between what he called advertising and selling.
Oh, how did he define that?
His idea was that the initial buzz and the conversations the Edsel would generate, people saying to you, hey, did you read about that new Edsel, or have you seen that car yet? That, in his mind, was the advertising.
Okay.
And he felt that level of attention was a guaranteed success. He was so sure of it, he was almost explaining his brilliant strategy as he was in the process of implementing it. Famous last words, maybe. But the strategy for the Edsel went beyond just advertising, didn't it? Ford actually took a rather unusual path when it came to setting up its network of dealerships for the new car.
They certainly did. Instead of introducing the Edsel through their existing Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealerships, they made the decision to build an entirely new, dedicated Edsel dealer network, right from the ground up.
That sounds expensive and complicated.
It was. A man named Krav was put in charge, and he was given the go-ahead to actively recruit dealers, not just from other manufacturers like GM or Chrysler, but even from within Ford's own existing divisions.
Poaching their own dealers?
Pretty much. The ambitious goal was to have 1,200 exclusive Edsel dealerships ready for the car's big introduction on September 4th, 1957.
1,200. Wow. And the emphasis wasn't just on getting a large number of dealers, was it? If I remember correctly, there was a strong focus on the quality of these dealerships.
Exactly. Kraft really stressed the importance of having quality dealers with quality service facilities.
Makes sense. You don't want bad service ruining a new car's reputation.
Right. The thinking was that if a brand new car like the Edsel had problems, and we'll get to that, and customers received poor service, that would reflect badly on the car itself, not just the individual dealership.
So dealers had to pony up some serious cash.
They did. This meant that prospective Edsel dealers had to make a pretty significant investment, often upwards of $100,000, just to get started.
So, for you to understand, despite its eventual failure, the Edsel wasn't necessarily a fundamentally bad car, at least according to the source we have here.
That's a really key point to take away. The book actually argues that in some ways, the Edsel embodied the spirit of its time, or at least the era in the mid-1950s when it was being designed.
How so?
It's described as clumsy, powerful, dowdy, gauche, well-meaning. Kind of mouthful.
Hey, yeah.
The author even suggests that some of its styling features, particularly the design of the rear-end wings, were later copied by competitors. So the design alone wasn't necessarily the main reason for its downfall.
It seems the initial problems with the quality of the early Edsels played a much more significant role in its ultimate demise, wouldn't you say?
Undeniably, this was critical. The very first Edsels that rolled off the assembly line, the ones that were supposed to generate excitement and positive word of mouth, well, they were unfortunately plagued with a whole host of issues.
Like what? Specific?
Oh, yeah. We're talking about things like oil leaks, hoods that wouldn't open properly, trunks that were stuck shut,
Oh, dear.
and even faulty push buttons that were practically impossible to move. There's even a story mentioned about a brand new Edsel's dashboard suddenly bursting into flames.
Yikes. Not exactly good press.
Not at all. Automotive News, a key industry publication, reported problems with poor paint quality, inferior sheet metal, faulty accessories, you name it.
And Consumers Union didn't help either.
No. To make matters worse, Consumers Union, a respected consumer testing organization, bought a test car and issued a very negative report. This really killed any initial positive buzz that might have been building.
So, a rough start. And Ford's attempts to try and revive the sales of the Edsel sound like they became increasingly desperate as time went on.
They really did. Henry Ford II himself even made a televised address directly to the dealers, promising the company's full support and stating very clearly, the Edsel is here to stay.
Which turned out not to be true.
Right. They also took the unusual step of sending out 1.5 million letters to potential customers, offering plastic-scale models of the car if they would just take a test drive.
1.5 million letters? Who paid for that?
Get this, the Edsel division itself had to foot the bill for this massive mailing, which was quite out of the ordinary. Usually the parent company covers stuff like that.
Ah.
They even started offering sales bonuses directly to the dealers as a way to lower the price for customers without cutting into the dealer's own profit margins, trying everything.
Even the way they advertised the car underwent a significant shift as they tried to boost sales, didn't it?
It did indeed. The initial advertising campaign was quite dignified, very sort of prestige-focused.
Trying to build that image.
Exactly. But as sales continued to disappoint, the tone of the advertising became much more strident, almost desperate. Slogans like, "Everyone who has seen it knows with us that the Edsel is a success," repeated almost like a mantra.
Trying to convince themselves, maybe.
Maybe. Eventually, they even resorted to more traditional and somewhat cliché appeals based on price and social status.
Like what?
Lines like, "They'll know you've arrived when you drive up in an Edsel, and the one that's really new is the lowest price too."
Oh, boy.
The source even notes this shift towards using rhymed slogans as a kind of sign of desperation within the advertising industry at the time.
Right. And the final chapter in the Edsel story came about relatively quickly in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, just a few months into the following year, January 14th, 1958, Ford made an announcement that essentially signaled the beginning of the end for the Edsel as an independent entity.
What was the announcement?
They announced the consolidation of the Edsel division with the Lincoln Mercury division, creating a new Mercury Edsel Lincoln division. MEL, they called it.
So basically folded it in.
Pretty much.
Ah.
This administrative move made it pretty clear to everyone that the Edsel was becoming something of a stepchild within the company, as the source puts it. The writing was on the wall.
A truly fascinating, though ultimately cautionary tale for you to reflect on. Let's turn now to a topic that touches the lives of almost everyone in the United States. The federal income tax.
Ah, yes. Taxes. Everyone's favorite.
Its widespread impact is certainly undeniable.
Absolutely. Just consider this. Back in 1964 alone, nearly 63 million individual tax returns were filed,
63 million.
generating billions of dollars in revenue. The very concept of having before-tax money and after-tax money in your own budget really highlights just how much this system influences our economic lives.
And yet it's a system that is often the target of a great deal of criticism, wouldn't you agree?
It certainly is. The source we have here points out several common complaints. One of the biggest is the feeling that the progressive tax rate structure, where higher earners are supposed to pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes,
Right, the basic idea.
is something of a lie because of the numerous loopholes that exist.
Ah, the loopholes.
These loopholes, critics argue, allow even the wealthiest individuals and corporations to legally avoid paying the top tax rates. For example, the book mentions that in 1960, even those who reported incomes of over $1 million ended up paying, on average, well under 50% of their income in taxes.
Which was about the same as?
Roughly the same percentage that someone earning around $42,000 might pay. So much for progressivity in practice, some would say.
The temptation for small-scale tax evasion and the sheer complexity of the tax code itself are also major points of contention for many people.
Exactly. The idea that the income tax is like a serpent in the American Garden of Eden, constantly tempting people to find ways to shave off a little bit from what they owe every April. That's a pretty strong image from the book.
It is.
And with the basic tax law itself running over 1,000 pages, and then the related rulings and regulations adding up to another 17,000 pages or so.
Whoa.
It's really no wonder that critics argue it's a law that many citizens can't even understand well enough to comply with on their own.
Right, leading people to need professional help.
Which can lead to a situation where only those with significant financial resources can afford the professional tax advice needed to legally minimize their tax burden.
It's interesting for you to see the historical perspective offered in the source, comparing the American experience with the income tax to that of Britain.
Yeah, the British income tax actually has a long and initially very unpopular history. It faced numerous setbacks before it was gradually accepted as a necessary part of the government's revenue stream.
And the rates got pretty high eventually.
What's quite striking when you look at the British experience is the eventual adoption of very high top tax rates. By the mid-1960s, the top rate in Britain actually exceeded 90%.
90%.
Whereas the United States is described in the book as something of a laggard when it came to implementing a permanent federal income tax. There were several short-lived attempts in the U.S., often brought about by the need to finance wartime efforts like the Civil War.
Right. Wars cost money.
Before it became a permanent fixture with the 16th Amendment.
And the period after World War I in the United States saw a general trend towards lower overall tax rates, but it also marked the emergence of specific tax breaks that benefited certain groups.
That's right. The return to normalcy in the 1920s did indeed lead to lower tax rates across the board. However, this era also witnessed the creation of significant tax advantages, such as the preferential treatment of capital gains, which began in 1922.
Capital gains, still a big topic today.
Absolutely. And the percentage depletion allowance for the petroleum industry, introduced in 1926. These kinds of provisions have been a source of ongoing debate and discussion ever since.
The source also touches on the role of the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, and the increasing use of computers in processing tax returns.
Right. The IRS, with the introduction of computers in the 1960s, was initially envisioned as something of a friendly monster.
Friendly monster, okay.
The hope was that these new technologies would improve efficiency in processing the massive volume of tax returns and maybe even make it easier for taxpayers to comply with the law.
And the head of the IRS at the time had a specific approach.
Yeah, Mortimer Kaplan, who headed the IRS during this period, introduced what he called a new direction. His focus was on encouraging voluntary compliance through taxpayer education, rather than relying solely on strict enforcement measures.
Trying to be less adversarial.
Kind of. This approach recognized the fact that a very large percentage of total tax revenue, around 97%, the book says, comes from taxpayers honestly assessing and paying their taxes.
So focus on helping the honest majority.
That was the idea.
Yet, those much-debated loopholes continue to be a significant feature of the American tax system.
Absolutely. The capital gains tax provision is highlighted as a major example of a loophole. It allows profits from the sale of long-term investments to be taxed at significantly lower rates than ordinary income.
Right.
The book also mentions other avenues of escape that were often utilized by wealthier individuals and corporations to reduce their tax liability, such as the use of corporate pension plans, tax-free foundations, and personal holding companies.
And the percentage depletion allowance specifically for the oil industry receives particularly critical attention in the source.
It does. The book draws a sharp contrast between this allowance and the standard accounting practice of depreciation.
How so?
Well, normally with depreciation, deductions are limited to the original cost of an asset and are spread out over its useful life.
Okay, standard accounting.
But with the percentage depletion allowance for oil, owners of producing oil wells were able to deduct a fixed percentage, 27.5% back then, of their gross annual income from the well, indefinitely.
Indefinitely, even after recovering the costs.
Even long after they had fully recovered their initial investment. So it was quite a generous provision for the industry.
The discussion of how entertainment expenses were treated under the tax code provides a particularly vivid illustration for you of the complexities and, at times, the sheer absurdity of the law.
Oh yeah, the yacht example. The tax rules that were in place after 1963, while attempting to discourage overly lavish spending on entertainment, didn't actually put an outright ban on it.
So what did they do?
Instead, they allowed deductions for expenses related to entertainment facilities like yachts or hunting lodges, if those facilities were used for business purposes more than half of the time.
More than half, so 51%.
Pretty much. The example given in the book, where someone could potentially double their after-tax income simply by ensuring their yacht was used for business just over 50% of the time, really underscores how nonsensical some of these provisions could become in practice.
That does seem generous. And these kinds of tax advantages could even become intertwined with appeals for charitable giving, creating some rather interesting dynamics.
Exactly. The source points out how fundraising appeals from various organizations would often awkwardly try to balance their call for people to do good works with a detailed explanation of the potential tax benefits that donors could receive.
Kind of like, be generous, and also, here's how you save money.
Right. Some organizations even went so far as to provide detailed booklets explaining how to achieve greater tax savings through charitable contributions.
Ultimately, the sheer complexity of the tax loopholes seems to serve a specific purpose, even if that purpose wasn't necessarily intended when they were first created.
The book argues that, in this case, complexity doesn't necessarily promote fairness or equity. In fact, it often does just the opposite.
How?
It tends to benefit a relatively small minority of individuals and corporations who have the resources and expertise to navigate these complicated rules.
The ones who can afford the lawyers and accountants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This complexity also makes genuine tax reform incredibly difficult to achieve.
Why is that?
Due to the power of lobbying efforts, a general sense of public indifference fueled in part by, well, just not understanding the intricacies.
It's hard to get worked up about something you don't understand.
Right. And what the book calls the impenetrable elephant hide of the tax code itself, it's just too dense and complex for major changes.
A very powerful analogy for you to consider. Let's transition now to another area where information and finance directly intersect: the issue of insider trading.
Okay.
It's quite interesting to learn that the practice wasn't always viewed with the same level of disapproval that it is today.
Indeed. The source you've provided points out that historically, using what was often referred to as inside dope non-public information to make a profit in stock trading was largely accepted practice.
Really, like, who?
Prominent figures like Nathan Rothschild using carrier pigeons to get news of Waterloo early, or John Jacob Astor profiting from early news. They amassed significant fortunes in part by acting on early access to important news, and there was generally little in the way of public outcry or legal repercussions.
So when did that start to change?
It wasn't really until the early part of the 20th century that the ethics of corporate insiders trading on privileged information began to be widely questioned. This eventually led to the passage of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934
Okay, a major piece of legislation.
and the implementation of Rule 10b-5 in 1942. These regulations were aimed at preventing fraudulent activities and the omission of important or material facts in the securities markets.
But it seems that Rule 10b-5, which was intended to curb insider trading, was somewhat ineffective in its early years.
For a couple of decades, yeah, it was largely unenforced. It was kind of just there.
So what changed?
It wasn't until the landmark civil complaint was filed against the Texas Gulf Sulphur Company and 13 of its insiders in 1966 that the enforcement of rules against insider trading really began to gain traction. This case marked a significant turning point.
The Texas Gulf Sulphur case itself provides a fascinating example for you of how inside information could be used and the legal consequences that eventually followed for those involved.
Yeah, it's a great story. The story essentially begins with the company's secret drilling and the discovery of what appeared to be a very promising mineral deposit near Timmins, Ontario, at a site known as Kid 55. This started in November of 1963.
Okay, so they found something potentially big.
Potentially huge. Several individuals within the company, including executives like Holick and Dark, initially acted with some caution, but as the drilling results continued to be positive, they began to significantly increase their personal holdings of Texas Gulf Sulphur stock.
Buying stock based on the secret news.
Exactly. And also started buying call options, which gave them the right to purchase the stock at a later date at a predetermined price.
Yeah.
Big leverage if the stock went up.
And they tried to keep it quiet.
Oh, yeah. They even went so far as to drill a misleading dummy drill hole nearby as a way to try and divert attention from the actual discovery.
Wow, elaborate. And the level of secrecy surrounding the company's land acquisition program in the area was quite intense, wasn't it?
It was extremely so. They were buying up land options all around the discovery site under different names. They even went to the extent of involving the Curtis Publishing Company.
The magazine publisher, like Saturday Evening Post?
That's the one. They offered them profit concessions as a way to help keep their activities under wraps and prevent news of the potential mineral find from leaking out.
That seems unusual.
Highly unusual.
Huh.
The drilling activity in early April of 1964 became very intense, with geologists working under challenging conditions, but the results they were getting strongly indicated that a major discovery had been made, something potentially worth hundreds of millions.
As you might expect, rumors began to circulate, particularly within the closely knit Canadian mining grapevine.
By April of '64, the rumors were indeed spreading rapidly. Fueled by reports and publications that were closely followed by the mining industry, like the Northern Miner, as well as in more mainstream newspapers like the Toronto Daily Star.
So the secret was starting to leak.
Definitely. Texas Gulf's headquarters in New York was reportedly bombarded with inquiries from investors and the media, but the company consistently downplayed the significance of the drilling results.
What did the president do?
Even the company's president, Claude Stevens, sought advice from Thomas S. Lamont, who was a senior member of the board of directors with deep connections on Wall Street. Lamont's initial advice was that Stevens shouldn't be too concerned about the reports in the Canadian press, but that they should issue a statement if the news started to appear in U.S. newspapers.
And when the news did reach the U.S. press, Texas Gulf's response was, to put it mildly, somewhat understated and ultimately misleading.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. On Sunday, April 12, 1964, Texas Gulf issued a press release that characterized the reports of a major discovery as exaggerated and unreliable.
Even though they knew better internally.
Absolutely. They admitted only to having preliminary indications from drilling on one property near Timmins, despite the growing evidence internally that they had indeed found a very significant ore body. This initial press release would later become a crucial point in the legal battles.
Especially when you consider the significant jump in the company's stock price after the more accurate and positive announcement was finally made.
Exactly. Following the delayed but much more positive announcement on April 16th, the price of Texas Gulf sulfur stock soared from around $18 before the rumor started, up towards $30 during the misleading release, and then shooting way up past $70 after the real news hit.
Wow. So the insiders who bought early made a killing.
They did, and the SEC noticed. The United States Court of Appeals ultimately ruled in August of 1968 that several of the company's insiders were guilty of violating securities laws by trading on non-public information.
And what about that press release?
Significantly, the court also found that the initial press release issued on April 12th was not only inaccurate, but also ambiguous and misleading under Rule 10b-5.
This case was widely regarded as a major victory for the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, in its efforts to regulate insider trading, wasn't it?
It was indeed hailed as a famous victory for the SEC, and it's generally considered to mark the beginning of a more serious and sustained effort to try and create a stock market where the odds weren't unfairly stacked in favor of those who had access to privileged, non-public information.
A level playing field, or closer to it.
It sent a clear signal that using inside information for personal gain could have serious legal consequences.
Shifting away from the complexities of regulation, let's explore a story of significant technological disruption, the rise of Xerox.
Ah, Xerox. Another game changer.
The contrast between the initial adoption of the mimeograph machine and the rapid acceptance of later office copiers is quite remarkable.
It truly is. When the mimeograph machine was first introduced way back in 1887, it wasn't an immediate sensation. People just didn't readily see the need to make large numbers of copies of typical office documents.
Hard to imagine now.
Right. The earliest adopters were primarily non-business organizations. It actually took quite a bit of effort to convince companies and professionals of its value and how it could fit into and improve their existing office routines. Keep in mind that even typewriters and the use of carbon paper weren't yet widespread at that time.
But the landscape of office copying underwent a dramatic transformation in the 1950s.
The 1950s were really a raw, pioneering period for mechanized office copying. Suddenly, a whole range of different machines started appearing on the market, things like Thermofax, Autostat, Verifax.
I think I've heard of Thermofax.
Yeah, these machines were capable of producing copies relatively quickly and inexpensively without the need for a master stencil like the mimeograph. They filled a real need in offices and had a powerful psychological appeal for people.
But they weren't perfect, right?
No, they all had certain limitations, like requiring special types of paper or producing copies that were often damp or didn't have the best image quality or faded over time.
And then came the truly revolutionary technological breakthrough of xerography.
Xerography was the real game changer. It was a process, electrostatics, basically, that allowed for the creation of dry, high-quality, permanent copies on ordinary paper, plain paper, with a minimum of fuss and without the need for special chemicals or treated paper.
That sounds like the dream machine.
It pretty much was. The impact on offices was immediate and massive. The total number of copies made annually in the United States exploded from around 20 million in the mid-1950s to literally billions by the 1960s.
Billions, wow.
And that doesn't even take into account the figures from international markets.
Yeah.
It was, as the book aptly describes it, a period of copying mania.
And Xerox was right at the center of this revolution, experiencing a period of phenomenal and rapid growth as a company.
Oh, absolutely. Xerox, which was initially known as Haloid Xerox, saw its sales skyrocket throughout the 1960s. Their revenue jumped from $33 million in 1959 to over $500 million by 1966.
Incredible growth.
Their rate of growth was so incredibly high that their chief executive officer, Joe Wilson, even joked that it couldn't possibly be sustained, or their sales would end up exceeding the entire gross national product of the United States.
Ah, nice problem to have.
Right. The company rapidly climbed the ranks of the Fortune 500 list of the largest American companies, and their stock became what the book calls the stock market Golconda of the 60s,
Meaning
meaning a source of immense wealth. It generated a significant number of individuals who became known as Xerox millionaires due to the soaring value of their company's stock.
The development of the xerography process itself was a long and quite challenging journey, wasn't it? It wasn't an overnight success.
No, it certainly wasn't. The fundamental principles of the Carlson process, which formed the basis of xerography, were actually developed independently by an inventor named Chester Carlson, working alone in Astoria, Queens, before the Halard Company became interested in his invention around 1946.
So Halide picked it up later.
Yeah, Joseph C. Wilson Jr., who was on the verge of becoming the company's president, played a crucial role in recognizing the potential of Carlson's work, even though it was still very rudimentary.
Icarus.
A big one. Halard secured the rights to the process in exchange for royalty payments to both Carlson and the Battelle Memorial Institute, where Carlson had done further development, and they committed to sharing the substantial costs of further development.
And the name.
The name xerography, which literally means dry writing in Greek, was coined in 1948.
Okay.
The development process faced numerous technical hurdles and setbacks. It was really difficult. And at one point, Halard even seriously considered selling their rights to IBM.
Wow, that would have changed history.
Wouldn't it? Thankfully, they didn't go through with it. Their financial investment in perfecting the technology was massive for a company their size, but it ultimately paid off spectacularly. The University of Rochester also played a role, making an early investment in the technology that paid off handsomely for them, too.
Xerox went on to offer a very comprehensive line of copiers, catering to a wide range of different office needs and budgets.
They did indeed. They had everything from the relatively compact desktop 914 model that was the big breakthrough machine.
Oh, workhorse.
Exactly. To high-speed, high-volume machines like the 2400, microfilm enlargement devices like the CopyFlow, and even early versions of document transmission technology like the LDX and the telecopier, kind of a precursor to the fax machine.
So a whole ecosystem.
Pretty much. But the 914, their first automatic xerographic product, remained one of their most important and successful machines for a long time.
The widespread availability of relatively inexpensive and high-quality copying technology also raised a whole new set of challenges, particularly in the area of copyright law.
Absolutely. As libraries and educational institutions became equipped with these new copying machines, it led to widespread unauthorized reproduction of copyrighted materials, books, articles, sheet music by teachers and students.
Which hurt authors and publishers?
Of course, it deprived authors and publishers of potential income from their work. However, legal action against this type of infringement was relatively rare during this period.
Why was that?
Partly because the instances of copying were often unknown to the copyright holders, someone making a single copy in a library. And partly because educators themselves may not have fully realized they were potentially breaking the law. It was just so easy and useful.
And the impact of new technologies on copyright and intellectual property rights is a debate that continues to be very relevant even today, wouldn't you say?
No, definitely. The source we're looking at even touches on the ideas of Marshall McLuhan.
The medium is the message.
Right. McLuhan famously suggested that the only real solution to the problems created by technology is more technology. In this context, it raises the question of whether traditional forms of author protection might ultimately be doomed in the face of ever-evolving copying and information-sharing technologies.
Still wrestling with that one.
We certainly are. It's certainly a thought-provoking perspective for you to consider.
A very interesting point to ponder. Let's turn our attention now to a much darker moment in American history and its immediate impact on the financial world, specifically on Wall Street. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Yes, a truly shocking event. The news of President Kennedy's assassination on that Friday afternoon in November of 1963 hit the floor of the New York Stock Exchange like a physical blow.
How did it unfold there?
Initial reports were fragmented and chaotic, coming over the news tickers. Rumors began to spread very rapidly among the traders and brokers, just confusion and disbelief at first.
The immediate reaction in the stock market was quite unprecedented, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. In the brief 27 minutes between the confirmed news hitting the floor and the market being ultimately closed for the day.
Just 27 minutes.
Yeah. Stock prices declined at an astonishing and unparalleled rate. Just free fall. It wiped out an estimated $13 billion in the total value of all listed stocks in less than half an hour.
$13 billion. Incredible.
The Board of Governors of the exchange ultimately made the decision to halt trading early due to the shock and uncertainty. They just rang the bell and shut it down.
And this sudden and sharp panic in the market had immediate and potentially worsening consequences for existing financial vulnerabilities, such as the situation involving the brokerage firm Hopton Company that was mentioned earlier in the book.
It certainly did. Hoft was already in trouble because of a scandal involving vegetable oil futures. The prospect of Hopton Company potentially facing bankruptcy and the forced liquidation of their customer accounts at what were essentially panic-level prices became significantly more dire in the immediate aftermath of the assassination.
A crisis on top of a crisis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Beyond the direct financial impact, the source describes a palpable sense of paralyzing despair that gripped many, understandably. However, it also suggests that for some individuals working on Wall Street, the very immediate work at hand, the need to manage the unfolding market crisis, deal with the Hop situation,
Right. Practical problems to solve.
actually provided a kind of psychological benefit amidst the broader tragedy. It gave them a specific task to focus on during a time of great shock and uncertainty.
Turning our attention to a different kind of crisis now, the electrical manufacturing price-fixing scandal reveals a truly shocking level of collusion among some of the nation's largest corporations.
This scandal, which really came to public attention through the Senate subcommittee hearings led by Senator Estes Kefauver in 1961, it was a big one. It involved widespread price fixing and bid rigging within the electrical manufacturing industry. Think huge turbines, transformers, switchgear.
We're really big stuff.
Exactly. It resulted in significant financial penalties for 29 different firms and 45 of their employees, as well as, incredibly, the imposition of jail sentences for 7 of the executives involved in February of 1961.
Executives going to jail. That must have been a shock back then.
It was huge news. Unprecedented for that kind of white-collar crime involving major corporations like GE and Westinghouse.
And it seems the general public's understanding of the specific details of these illegal activities was somewhat limited due to the nature of the legal proceedings.
That's correct. Because the companies and individuals involved largely pleaded guilty or offered no defense, nolo contendere, in court, and because the records of the grand jury investigations were kept secret, the public had relatively little access to the specific details of the violations.
So Kefauver's hearings were meant to shed light.
Exactly. Senator Kefauver felt it was crucial for the public to understand the extent of the wrongdoing, which is why he convened the Senate hearings, to get it all out in the open.
What the hearings ultimately revealed about the inner workings of these supposedly fiercely competitive companies was quite astonishing. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. The testimony and evidence presented showed that executives from major companies like General Electric and Westinghouse, and smaller ones too, were secretly meeting.
Meeting to do what?
To agree on non-competitive pricing for their products, to rig the bidding process for large contracts, often with government entities or utilities.
So cheating the customers and taxpayers?
Pretty much. And even to allocate specific shares of the market among themselves for significant pieces of equipment, like you take this contract, we'll take the next one.
Wow. How did they keep it secret?
They went to elaborate lengths, using code numbers to refer to specific agreements or even companies, making important phone calls from public payphones rather than their office lines.
Like spies or something?
Kind of.
Yep.
And even falsifying their expense account records to conceal the true nature of their meetings, claiming they were for industry association gatherings or something innocent.
But their extensive efforts to conceal this widespread scheme ultimately did not succeed.
That's right. The whole thing began to unravel when a whistleblower from within one of the smaller companies involved came forward in 1959.
Ah, the whistleblower. Often how these things break.
Exactly. This individual's cooperation then led to others within the industry deciding to cooperate with Robert A. Biggs, who was the head of the antitrust division of the Department of Justice at the time. He really pursued it vigorously.
And that blew the lid off.
It helped expose the full extent of the illegal conspiracy. The media coverage of the scandal was extensive, and the public reaction was quite strong, particularly when they saw these high-level, respected corporate executives being sent to jail for their actions.
The source we have suggests that the full truth of what actually transpired within a company as large as General Electric, for example, might never be completely known due to a significant breakdown in internal communication.
Yeah, that's a fascinating aspect. The testimony that came out during the investigations really revealed a struggle with internal communication within GE that was so profound it seemed almost impossible to determine exactly who knew what and who had actually given specific orders.
Plausible deniability, maybe?
Or just genuine confusion. There was a very real sense that instructions could be easily misinterpreted or even intentionally obscured as they moved through the corporate hierarchy. Like, a policy directive against price fixing might exist on paper, but the managers got a different message through nods and winks or pressure to meet profit targets.
The defense offered by some of the executives involved provides a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, look into their justifications for participating in these illegal activities.
Oh, absolutely. A man named Jin, for example, who actually received a prison sentence for his role, claimed that he had essentially disregarded a direct order from one superior against engaging in price fixing.
He admitted ignoring an order.
Yes, because he claimed he had received contrary orders or signals from other superiors who were, in his words, more articulate, persuasive, and forceful, and who strongly believed in the importance of maintaining price stability within the industry, avoiding ruinous competition, they called it.
Price stability meaning keeping prices high.
Basically. He even famously said, reflecting on his actions, that the people who were advocating the devil were able to sell me better than the philosophers that were selling the Lord.
Wow. Quite a quote.
Isn't it?
Another executive, Shelik, introduced a concept he called impacts as a form of communication that significantly influenced his understanding of the company's actual policy on competition, which is quite insightful.
Stilich described how certain events that occurred within the company, like his own superior, being specifically directed by his boss to have lunch with a competitor,
Okay.
sent a very strong impact, a signal that directly contradicted the company's stated policy against collusion with rivals.
So actions spoke louder than written policies.
Exactly. These kinds of impacts, in his view, ultimately led him to believe that the company didn't genuinely respect or enforce its own rules against anti-competitive behavior. The real message was, meet the numbers, even if it meant bending the rules.
And the actual methods they used to carry out the price fixing were quite elaborate and even had their own unique terminology, didn't they?
They did. They developed what they referred to as the phase of the moon formula.
Phase of the moon, seriously.
Seriously. This was apparently a system they used, particularly for sealed bids on certain types of equipment, to rotate the privilege of submitting the lowest bid among the conspiring companies.
How did it work?
It sounds like it was based on the calendar, maybe rotating every 2 weeks or so, corresponding roughly to phases of the moon. It was a surprisingly complex mechanism designed to try and ensure that all the participating companies got their fair share of the available business while also maintaining the illusion of competition.
Incredible. Just layers of deception.
It really added another layer of complexity and secrecy to their already illegal scheme.
Let's shift our focus now from illegal collusion to a dramatic, albeit ultimately unsuccessful, attempt at significant stock market manipulation. The story of the Piggly Wiggly corner.
Ah, Clarence Saunders and Piggly Wiggly. A classic Wall Street tale. The source uses the E.L. Bruce Company's stock rise first as an example of market drama.
Right, that dramatic rise in E.L. Bruce stock back in 1958, where it soared from under $17 per share to an astonishing $190 in just a few months.
Culminating in a single-day jump of $100.
Really highlights the...
Right.
The source then takes a look back at a more historical and deliberate attempt to corner a stock. Clarence Saunders' attempt to corner the stock of his own company, Piggly Wiggly, back in 1922 and 1923.
For our listener, can you briefly explain the mechanics of what a corner is in the stock market and how it can create problems for those who have sold a stock short?
Certainly. A corner essentially occurs when an individual or a group gains control of a large enough proportion of a particular stock, specifically the shares available for trading, the floating supply,
Okay.
that those who have sold the stock short find themselves unable to locate and purchase the shares they need to deliver.
Remind us what short selling is again.
Short selling is borrowing shares you don't own, selling them on the open market, and hoping the price will fall so you can buy them back cheaper later, return them to the lender, and pocket the difference as profit.
Got it. Betting on a price drop.
Exactly. But if you're short and the price goes up, you lose money. And if someone corners the stock, they control all the available shares.
So the short sellers are trapped.
Precisely. The person or group who has successfully cornered the market can then demand extremely high prices for the limited number of shares available. They effectively put a severe squeeze on the short sellers, who are forced to buy back the shares at whatever exorbitant price is being asked just to close out their losing positions and fulfill their obligation to return the borrowed shares.
Nasty situation for the shorts. So Saunders tried this with his own stock. Why?
He felt Wall Street speculators, the bears, were unfairly driving down the price of his successful grocery chain stock through short selling. He wanted to punish them and teach them a lesson by engineering a corner.
So he started buying up Piggly Wiggly stock aggressively.
Very aggressively, using borrowed money. And he almost pulled it off. The short sellers were panicking.
Saunders' attempt to corner Piggly Wiggly stock ultimately led to intervention by the New York Stock Exchange, didn't it?
Yes, it did. As it became apparent that Saunders might actually succeed in cornering the stock and potentially bankrupting several brokerage firms caught in the short squeeze.
Which could destabilize the whole market.
Exactly. The governing committee of the New York Stock Exchange decided to step in. They took some drastic actions.
Like what?
They suspended trading in Piggly Wiggly stock and, quite controversially, they also extended the deadline by which the short sellers were required to deliver the shares they had borrowed. Gave them more time to find shares, basically breaking the squeeze. Why did they say they did that?
The exchange's justification was that they were concerned about the potential for a repeat of a severe market disruption similar to the Panic of Northern Pacific that had occurred decades earlier, protecting market stability, essentially. Saunders, as you can imagine, was not at all pleased with the exchange's decision to intervene in this way.
He was absolutely furious, livid. He publicly accused the exchange of being a welcher, essentially saying they were reneging on the established rules of the market just to save their buddies, the short sellers.
Strong words.
Very. He even went so far as to compare the exchange's actions to a bank suddenly refusing to honor its clearing obligations. He felt they changed the rules mid-game because he was winning. Interestingly, Saunders actually received some editorial support for his position from the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper, his hometown paper.
But in the end, the actions taken by the New York Stock Exchange ultimately led to Saunders' financial ruin, didn't they?
Yes, they did. The exchange ultimately decided to permanently delist Piggly Wiggly stock from trading on the exchange.
Kicked it off the NYSE.
Yep. They also granted the short sellers an extended 5-day period to cover their short positions. This effectively broke the corner that Saunders had been trying to establish and led to a significant decline in the stock price once trading resumed elsewhere.
So he lost everything.
He was financially ruined, lost control of Piggly Wiggly, lost his personal fortune. It's a dramatic example of how market forces, individual ambition, and regulatory interventions can collide with devastating consequences.
From market manipulation, let's now turn to explore the post-public service business ventures of David Lilienthal, a very prominent figure in American public life for many years.
Right. Lilienthal is fascinating because he was so iconic in public service. Head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, during its big years.
Building dams, bringing power to Appalachia.
Exactly. And later, the first chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, right after World War II, dealing with nuclear weapons and secrecy. A huge figure.
So after all that, he decided to transition into the world of business after his resignation from the AEC. That must have been quite a shift.
A massive shift, going from huge public responsibilities to, well, making money.
And his initial foray into the private sector involved some interesting connections in consulting work, didn't it?
Yes, he initially engaged in consulting work for a variety of different companies. He also developed a significant involvement with the prominent investment bank Lazard Frères, and particularly with the legendary and somewhat feared banker Andre Meyer.
Andre Meyer, a big name on Wall Street back then.
Huge, very powerful, very secretive. And Lilienthal got involved with him.
It was through this connection, as I understand it, that he played a pivotal role in the dramatic transformation of a relatively small company into a much larger and more successful enterprise.
That's correct. Lilienthal was instrumental in the significant growth of a company then known as Mineral Separation North American Corporation. A bit of a mouthful.
What do they do?
Mining and chemicals, basically. Through a series of strategic mergers, acquisitions, and other financial maneuvers, largely guided by Andre Meyer, with Lilienthal executing and managing, he led its transformation into a major corporation known as Minerals and Chemicals Philip Corporation.
Okay.
Under his leadership, the company's annual revenues skyrocketed. And this ultimately led to a considerable amount of personal wealth for Lilienthal himself.
And his compensation package included a rather significant stock option, which proved to be particularly lucrative for him.
Yes, that was key. As part of his compensation, Lilienthal received a stock option that allowed him to purchase a large number of shares of minerals and chemicals stock at a fixed low price in the future.
A common executive perk even then.
Right. As the company grew and its stock price on the open market increased substantially, thanks partly to his efforts and Meyer's deals, he was able to exercise his option. He bought the shares at the lower preset price and then held or sold them at a significant profit.
Making millions.
Substantial capital gains for him, yes, which were also subject to favorable tax treatment compared to ordinary income at the time, as we discussed earlier, the lower capital gains rate.
Right, tying back to the tax discussion.
Exactly. He even described the moment when minerals and chemicals stock was officially listed on the New York Stock Exchange as his own symbolic moment of triumph in his transition to the business world. He'd made it, in that sense.
The excerpts from Lilienthal's diary offer a fascinating personal glimpse into his motivations for entering the business world and his experiences once he made that leap.
Yeah, the book quotes his diaries. They reveal his initial feelings of uncertainty as he embarked on this new career path. He wasn't sure he'd fit in or succeed.
Understandable, given his background.
Right. As well as his strong desire to understand the methods and strategies employed by someone as successful and influential as Andre Meyer in the world of investment banking. He was kind of in awe trying to figure out Meyer's secrets.
Learning from the master.
He also reflects on the sheer amount of hard work and effort that he observed was involved in the investment banking business. It wasn't easy money. As for his own motivations,
What did he say?
he explicitly mentions his desire to build personal wealth through capital gains. He needed the money after leaving public service, and also to experience firsthand the competitive arena of the business world, to prove he could do it.
Okay.
Over time, his diary entries show his increasing engagement and commitment to minerals and chemicals, and he even notes that his initial perception of the business world as potentially dull was quickly proven wrong. He found it exciting, far from dull.
His book, Big Business, A New Era, which he published later, actually sparked a considerable amount of debate and discussion, didn't it?
Yes, it did. In the book, Lilienthal, drawing on his TVA and AEC experience, argued for big business. He explored his perspectives on the role of big industry in society, the concept of individualism within large organizations, the increasing influence of technology, and the existing antitrust laws.
And that was controversial.
Very. His views were somewhat controversial because the prevailing mood among many liberals and intellectuals at the time was still quite skeptical, if not hostile, towards big corporations. Antitrust sentiment was strong.
So he was defending bigness.
He was. He found himself in disagreement with prominent figures like Morris Cook and those who were generally in favor of more aggressive trust-busting policies.
It's interesting to note his perspective on the necessity of bigness in certain industries, which seemed to be informed by his experiences leading the AEC and the TVA.
Exactly. Based on his experiences with large-scale public projects building the atomic bomb, electrifying a huge region, Lilienthal argued for the necessity of having large organizations, big resources, big planning in certain sectors to achieve efficiency and to undertake complex and ambitious projects.
You couldn't build the TVA with small businesses.
That was his point. This perspective put him at odds with those who were more critical of the concentration of economic power in large corporations and feared its impact on democracy and individualism.
For you to consider, there's perhaps an interesting angle to explore regarding Lilienthal's significant financial success through stock options, a mechanism that some might view as taking advantage of a tax advantage or loophole.
That's certainly a point that could be raised, and Brooks sort of implies it without hitting you over the head. Lilienthal champions big, quasi-public endeavors, then makes his fortune using a private mechanism favored by tax law.
Right, a bit of a tension there.
The source material itself acknowledges the potential for such questions, but doesn't offer a direct judgment on the matter. It's definitely something for you to think about in the context of his career trajectory and his arguments.
Lilienthal's involvement in large-scale development projects didn't end with minerals and chemicals. He later became involved with the Development and Resources Corporation, or DNR, which had an international reach.
Yes, after cashing out significantly from minerals and chemicals, he started DNR to basically apply the TVA model internationally, using private capital but focusing on integrated resource development.
Where do they work?
Through DNR, Lilienthal became involved in major development projects around the world, most notably the ambitious Des Dam project in Iran under the Shah. A massive undertaking.
Trying to replicate the TVA in Iran.
Essentially. Over time, the Development and Resources Corporation expanded its operations to other countries, Colombia, Ivory Coast, and even became involved in urban development projects within the United States. However,
A complication.
It's also worth noting that the company's work in Vietnam later became a subject of controversy during the Vietnam War, seen by some as part of the problematic American nation-building effort there.
Okay, so a mixed legacy there too. Let's now shift our focus to a somewhat different aspect of corporate life, the dynamics and evolution of stockholder meetings.
Ah, the annual corporate ritual?
The contrast presented in the source between the annual meetings of AT&T and Pfizer is quite revealing about different corporate cultures.
Yeah, Brooks paints two very different pictures. The annual AT&T stockholder meeting described in the book sounds like it was often a rather contentious affair, almost a circus sometimes,
Contentious how?
marked by a strong element of shareholder activism, particularly from well-known gadflies or professional stockholders. In particular, a woman named Wilma Sauce is highlighted for her persistent questioning of management.
What kind of things did she do?
She'd make speeches, criticize executive pay, challenge board decisions. She even made a rather bold move of nominating a psychoanalyst to the company's board of directors.
A psychoanalyst. Why?
Her argument, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, was that the board needed someone to understand their motivations. Her interactions with the chairman, Frederick Kappel, were often tense, theatrical even. There's an account of her microphone being abruptly turned off during one meeting. Wow. Shutting down a shareholder.
Yeah. The atmosphere seemed to include booing directed at professional stockholders like Sauce and another one, Evelyn Y. Davis, but also a noticeable display of regional pride among some of the amateur stockholders who attended, often defending management.
And it's mentioned that the company's management clearly held significant control over the outcome of proxy votes, which is an important factor in these meetings.
Undeniably, that's key. The way proxy votes were structured and solicited, management almost always had the vast majority of votes locked up before the meeting even started, so the floor debates were largely symbolic.
Okay, so AT&T was theater, maybe, but management won. What about Pfizer?
In stark contrast, the annual meeting of Pfizer, under the leadership of Chairman John McKean, appears to have been a much more welcoming and convivial event, like a big family gathering. McKean is described as warmly greeting the stockholders personally, remembering names. Attendees even received free sample kits of the company's products. Vitamins, maybe. Nice perk.
Right. The reception given to professional stockholder John Gilbert, another famous corporate critic, was notably less hostile at Pfizer than at many other companies' meetings. Brooks suggests a greater sense of genuine communication and interaction, or at least the appearance of it, between Pfizer's management and its stockholders. Different style completely.
Interesting contrast. Okay, moving to another legal battle. The case between B.F. Goodrich and Donald Wohlgemuth over alleged theft of trade secrets related to spacesuits. That sounds specific.
Very specific and very high stakes at the time during the space race. B.F. Goodrich filed a lawsuit against Donald Wohlgemuth after he left his position with them where he worked on spacesuit technology.
Right, for the Apollo program, presumably.
Exactly. He left to join a competitor, International Latex Corporation, which also had a spacesuit division. Goodrich alleged that Wohlgemuth possessed valuable trade secrets related to their spacesuit technology.
And they sued to stop him.
They sought a court injunction to prevent him from revealing these secrets and, crucially, from working in the spacesuit department of any other company, basically trying to sideline him professionally in that field.
Wow. How serious was Goodrich about this?
The seriousness with which Goodrich viewed this case is underscored by the personal involvement of a top executive, Mr. Jeter, who testified. They saw it as protecting their crown jewels.
What was Wohlgemuth's defense?
The defense actually conceded that Wohlgemuth had indeed been privy to confidential information and trade secrets during his time at Goodrich. They couldn't really deny that.
So what did they argue?
They argued that he hadn't taken any physical documents or notes with him when he left, and that he wouldn't necessarily remember all the specific details over time. And more importantly, that he had a right to earn a living using his general skills and knowledge.
Goodrich must have disagreed strongly.
Goodrich argued that, as a pioneer in the development of pressure spacesuit technology, they would suffer irreparable injury if Wohlgemuth, with his intimate inside knowledge, went to work for a direct competitor, even if he didn't intentionally disclose any specific secrets. They argued disclosure was inevitable just by him doing his job.
What did the defense say to that?
The defense countered by arguing that disclosure was not inevitable. They said you couldn't enjoin someone from working based on what might happen, based only on suspicion.
Interestingly, Wohlgemuth himself offered his perspective on the situation after the legal proceedings had concluded. What did he say?
Well, the court did issue a limited injunction, basically telling him not to disclose specific Goodrich secrets. But Wolgemuth felt that the court order didn't actually significantly impede his work at LaTeX.
Why not?
Because, in his view, the secrets that Goodrich was so concerned about were largely things related to approaches or designs that LaTeX had already explored internally and found to be unsatisfactory in their own research and development efforts. So knowing them wasn't actually that helpful to LaTeX.
Huh. So Goodrich was protecting things the competitor didn't even want.
That was Wolgemuth's take, anyway. However, he did acknowledge that the whole experience being sued by his former employer had made him much more cautious about considering future job changes and the potential legal ramifications. Gave him pause.
Understandable. Finally, let's look at the challenges involved in defending the British pound sterling in the 1960s. This provides a fascinating look into the high-stakes world of international finance and the role of central banks.
Yeah, this is a shift to the macro level. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York played a very important role in international monetary defense during this period under the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates.
Defending the dollar primarily.
Primarily the US dollar, but also at times in providing support for other major currencies like the British pound, which was seen as a key partner currency.
And there was a crisis in '64.
The monetary crisis that occurred in 1964 really highlighted the significant difficulties that central banks face when they try to combat speculation in the foreign exchange markets.
Why is speculation so hard to fight?
Because it's often intertwined with legitimate international trade and investment flows, making it very difficult to track and control. And speculators can mobilize huge amounts of money very quickly to bet against a currency they think is overvalued.
The source also touches on the contrasting cultures of central banking in Europe at the time.
Right, the traditional formality, especially on the continent, versus the evolving, more informal first-name basis relationships being built, often through phone calls, and the increasing dominance of the English language in these international financial discussions. The Fed in New York was often at the center of this network.
So the sterling crisis of November 1964. What happened?
There was a notable disagreement between the Bank of England, the UK's central bank, and the newly elected Labour government under Harold Wilson.
About what?
About the appropriate response to growing pressure on the pound. Specifically, whether to raise the bank rate, the main interest rate, significantly to try and defend the pound's fixed value against the dollar. The government resisted, fearing it would hurt the economy.
What happened then?
This delay and uncertainty ultimately led to what was described as a black day in the City of London on Friday, November 20th. The Bank of England made a significant effort to support the pound at its floor level of 2.788255. But the selling pressure was immense.
They were losing money fast.
They were burning through their foreign currency reserves, rapidly trying to buy pounds. Widespread rumors of an imminent devaluation of the pound began to circulate, which of course fueled even more selling.
In response to this pressure, the Federal Reserve in the United States stepped in to try and provide support for the pound, utilizing what are known as swap agreements between central banks.
That's right. Swap lines were crucial. These are basically agreements where central banks agree to exchange their currencies up to a certain limit, so the Fed could provide dollars to the Bank of England, allowing them to intervene in the market.
So the Fed intervened.
After the close of the markets in London, the Federal Reserve intervened in the New York market to support the pound. And over that weekend, a dramatic effort led by key figures like Alfred Hayes, the president of the New York Fed, and Charles Coombs, who ran the foreign exchange operations.
What did they do?
They undertook a frantic effort, working the phones nonstop to try and secure additional credit commitments from other major European central banks, Germany, France, Italy, etc., to assemble a huge rescue package to bolster the British pound's position.
Was it easy to get everyone on board?
No. It proved to be challenging. There were difficulties even in reaching key individuals, like Dr. Holtrop, the respected head of the Dutch central bank, who was apparently out sailing or something. Time was critical.
What happens on Monday?
Despite these behind-the-scenes efforts, the market reaction on Monday, November 23rd, was alarming. There was a significant rout of the pound, intense selling pressure, despite the Bank of England's continued intervention. It looked like the pound might break.
Ultimately, a coordinated international rescue package was put together, along with carefully crafted press releases, which helped to stabilize the situation, at least for the short term.
Yes, just in the nick of time. The Federal Reserve significantly increased the amount of swap credit available to the Bank of England, and commitments came in from the other central banks, totaling around $3 billion, a massive sum back then.
And they announced it.
Coordinated press announcements were made late Monday outlining the details of this international support package. This action led to an immediate and positive reaction in the foreign exchange markets.
How so?
Speculators who had been betting against the pound suddenly got scared. They rushed to cover their short positions, meaning they had to buy pounds back, which pushed the price up sharply. The immediate crisis was averted.
But it wasn't the end of the story for the pound.
No. It's worth noting that the British pound continued to face recurring crises in 1965 and 1966, and ultimately had to be devalued in 1967 anyway. This episode highlights the ongoing challenges in maintaining the stability of a currency under pressure, despite international support and domestic austerity measures implemented by the British government. It really underscores the constant pressures and complexities of managing a major international currency in a globalized financial system.
Well, that was truly a whirlwind tour through some incredibly significant and diverse business adventures.
It certainly has been. We've covered a lot of ground.
From the intense drama of market panics like '62 and the lessons learned from product failures like the Edsel,
Right.
to the ongoing debates about taxation, the landmark legal battles over insider trading and trade secrets, the transformative power of technological innovation like Xerox, the shocking price-fixing conspiracies, and the high-stakes world of international finance defending the pound.
These stories from the past, as different as they are, really do offer you some valuable insights.
Insights into what, would you say?
Well, insights into the ever-present nature of risk in the business world, the often unpredictable path of innovation, the ongoing need for and the limitations of regulation,
Yeah.
the enduring influence of human behavior, greed, fear, ambition, error on economic outcomes, and the increasingly intricate interconnectedness of the global economy, even back then.
So as you reflect on these historical adventures in the world of business, what recurring themes or fundamental aspects of human behavior do you find most striking? And how might understanding these events from the past inform your perspective on the business landscape of today?
That's the key question, isn't it? How much has really changed? It's certainly something for you to continue to think about.
And if any of these deep dives into these particular stories have sparked your curiosity, we definitely encourage you to delve into them further. John Brooks's book is a great read.
Absolutely. Timeless stuff.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.